My name is Chris Pittard. That's spelled Chris, and my last name is spelled Pittard, and I'm based out of San Antonio, Texas. I'm the owner of Olympiad Publishing, a publishing company that I established in 2018 because I found it difficult and frustrating to try to find publishers for my works. I have published 2 novels as well as 6 children's books. And today I'm here to talk really about the children's books because those seem to be the ones that have the most universal appeal. Up to this time, I've actually written 12 children's stories, but I've only published 6 books because it took a while to find an illustrator. In my case, I was looking for an illustrator who could illustrate African-American children because that's what my focus was on African-American children. And I wanted to have someone who could illustrate the children the way I wanted them illustrated. Mr. Bill Reed, who is a local illustrator here in San Antonio and has done a wonderful job illustrating my books. I started writing these children's books back in 2002 when my wife had been honored with her master's degree in journalism. And I asked her what was she going to do with her master's degree. And I said, I thought you ought to write, maybe write children's stories or whatever kinds of books. And she said, well, I don't do that kind of creative writing. And I said, you ought to. And she said, no, I don't do that, but I don't think you can do it if, you do write other stuff. I don't think you can write children's stories. And I said, I bet I can. So that's where the idea came from for me to at least start trying to write children's stories. My inspiration for the children's stories are my own daughters. I have 2 daughters who both have red hair, and their grandmother, my mother, who was African-American as well, also had red hair growing up, and she called her 2 granddaughters her Carrot Tops. So that's where the name of the series comes from, The Continuing Adventures of the Carrot Top Kids. And the Carrot Top Kids are based on real events that my daughters went through growing up as military kids. I served for 13 years as an Army officer, and we traveled all over the country and lived in a lot of different places. And as a result, my daughters went through a lot of interesting events. They had a lot of interesting experiences growing up as military kids. So I thought I would use those as an inspiration. And the first book, which is called The Puppies, and I'm going to move to the side because behind me is the virtual background, which shows the various books. So The Puppies was the first book that I wrote for my daughters, and it involves the first time that they got dogs and what kids don't like to have puppies. So that was the first one. Now, the books themselves are not Afrocentric in that they don't describe the experience of being African-American. They're not about the fact that the girls are African-American. They are African-American, and all the characters, or most of the characters, are African-American in the books, but the books themselves are not Afrocentric. They just show kids doing kid things. The second book in the series is called Fun in Mexico, and that describes the experience my daughters had when we went across the border from Texas to Laredo or Juarez or Matamoros, when the girls had an opportunity to shop in Mexico, to eat Mexican food, to listen to various types of Mexican music. And it describes their experience in Mexico when they learned a little bit of the Spanish language as well. The third book in the series begins their trek toward Alaska. And when we left Texas to go to Alaska, we went through California. So we visited Disney World, but of course, because of various copyright issues, I did not use Disney World or Disneyland as a part of the book, but instead I invented a place called Cartoon World, which has various cartoon figures and heroes and all kinds of fictional kinds of characters that the girls experienced while they went through Disneyland or similar to Disneyland. And in that book, the girls have an adventure at Cartoon World, which allows them to help each other out and use the Cartoon World characters, excuse me, to help them out as well. The last three books, though, I call the Alaska Trilogy. And I call them that because we lived in Alaska for a year as part of my military service. And actually, I chose Alaska over Hawaii because I thought Alaska would be more interesting, and it was. The first book of the Alaska Trilogy is called All the Way to Alaska. And what it describes is our trek from California all the way up to Fairbanks, Alaska, where it was that we actually were stationed. It shows our journey through California, through the Pacific Northwest, up into Canada, where we eventually got a ferry, which we stayed on for 3 days up to Alaska through Juneau and Sitka and places like that. And it shows how the girls saw whales and they interacted with the other kids on the ferry. And eventually we drove to Fairbanks from the ferry location, where we saw grizzly bears out there in the wild, which was really exciting as you drove by the grizzly bears as they're sitting on the side of the road waving at you saying, hey, come on, stop here. No, thank you very much. We kept driving. But we saw all kinds of animals on the way to Fairbanks, and that's all part of that book. The next one in the Alaska Trilogy is called Land of the Midnight Sun. And in Land of the Midnight Sun, it shows when we got there in the middle of July, how the weather was so different from what we had experienced in other places around the country. At that point, since it was still in July, the sun was out for over, the almost 24 hours. So when we got there, the girls wanted to get out and they wanted to ride their bikes and play and everything else, but it was 2:00 in the morning, but it looks just like it does outside right now. So it was kind of confusing for them, but it was very interesting for us during that summertime period. And the book describes an adventure they had exploring some of the areas around them, again, being exposed to various fauna and animals there in Alaska, including moose and foxes and so forth. And then the final book, the most recent one, which came out in December, is called Are We Really at the North Pole? And that's the one that's displayed here. A few pages of it are displayed here. And in that book, we talk about the winter wonderland, which is Alaska in Fairbanks in the wintertime, during the winter solstice, when the sun never comes out in that 24-hour period. So the entire day is in darkness. And on that day, we decided we would go visit the town of North Pole. Now, most people don't know this about Alaska, but the town of North Pole is where your letters go if you're anywhere in the world or in the United States. If you write a letter to Santa Claus, then it goes to North Pole, Alaska, because that is where it's addressed to, North Pole, Alaska. And the entire town of North Pole is based on the Santa Claus mythology. So the streets are named after reindeer, they're named after other characters within the Santa Claus mythology. And in the middle of the town is a large workshop. And in that workshop are elves making toys. Outside the workshop are reindeer in their pens. They have a 30-foot statue of Santa Claus outside the workshop. They have on top of the workshop are decorations showing, the reindeer and the sleigh and all that. And inside, of course, is Santa Claus and Mrs. Santa Claus as well. But of course, in our book, as you can see here on the end, in our book, when the Carrot Top kids meet Santa Claus, they meet what we consider the real Santa Claus. And in this case, of course, he's African-American, and his wife is also African-American. So that's kind of the twist to that book, is that they meet an African-American or Black Santa Claus, basically. And growing up, that's one thing that they did have around the house, was they had the depictions of Black Santa Claus rather than the typical white Santa Claus you might find in other people's homes. But those are the children's books. Again, there are 6 of them right now, and we're going to be continuing to publish them because we have found that there is a need for children's books of African American children doing kids stuff. And as a matter of fact, we attended what was called the San Antonio Black Authors Book Festival here in San Antonio. It was the 4th annual one. And in that situation, we sold several of the children's books because next week, I'm told, is called Black Children's Books Week here in the United States. I wasn't aware of that, but so they had all the children's book authors together right near the front of the venue, and we had an opportunity to sell a lot of books yesterday to a lot of kids who were really excited about the artwork, because the artwork jumps off the page at you. It's very colorful, it's very bold, and the characters themselves are, like I said, they're African American. They're characters that the kids can relate to, regardless of whether they're African American or not, because these are characters that are doing things that kids do. So we've had a lot of success in selling those books to a variety of kids. And those books, as in all the books, they can be found on barnesandnoble.com. They can be found on Amazon, Goodreads, and they can also be found at my website, which is called olympiadpublishing.com. So if you look on any of those sites, you can purchase the books. But of course, if you get them from my site, then not only will you get the books a little cheaper than you will on the other sites, but they will also be hand inscribed by me so that you get a personal note from the author. Now, earlier I mentioned that I had written two other books, and those 2 books can also be found online. The first one is called The Transmonaut Chronicles. Now, that sounds like a really strange name for a book, but what the book does, it describes the adventures that myself, my brother, and 2 of our best friends had back in 1977 when we went on a road trip from Texas to California. And as you can imagine, 4 young Black guys on a road trip for 2 weeks in a brand new 1977 black and gold special edition Trans Am. So for anyone who is familiar with the movies from the United States, you may be aware of the movie Smokey and the Bandit. And in the movie Smokey and the Bandit, that was the main vehicle in the movie, was a special edition black and gold Trans Am. And that was my car at the time. So that was the it car of the summer. So that car invited a lot of attention, both from young ladies as well as from the police. So we had a lot of adventures during that 2-week period. And the way that book came to be was that one of the people we met on the trip, someone that my brother was quite enamored with, 30 years later, they had lost contact after the trip. And 30 years later, they reconnected in a very odd way. And after my brother reconnected with this person, he called me and said, I reconnected with so-and-so. And I said, really? How did that happen? He said, well, and he described the situation. I said, well, that's really, kind of wild how that happened. He goes, well, I was thinking about it. Do you think you can write a book about the road trip? And I said, I guess I can. And that's how this book came about. So it took me several years, though, to actually write the book, because it was my first big writing project. And it was also one that I wanted to make sure was as factual as possible, because I was going to base it on true events. So I tried to contact as many people that were on the road trip, people that we met during the road trip, which we had not talked to in over 30 years at that point. I interviewed people. I got information from people. I did my research and eventually produced the book. And at that point, I was looking for someone to publish the book. I found an African-American publishing company here in San Antonio who took on the project and helped me to publish the book, market the book, and get it out there. And interestingly enough, the book at the end has its own kind of twist, because we find out why it was that my brother and this young woman lost contact, and it was not because of want of trying between the two of them, but there were other factors involved, and that becomes kind of the twist at the end of the book, that you find out why it was that they lost
Chris,
contact.
I'm letting you know you've just got another minute, so just be mindful of that.
Okay, well, great. My other novel is one called "If You Ain't Ranger, You Ain't," and it's about my my journey to become United States Army Ranger, and the racism and bigotry and discrimination, as well as bullying, that I faced in the 60s and 70s. So that's a very interesting book as well. So I again invite people to try to order the books either through my website, olympiadpublishing.com, through barnesandnoble.com, through goodreads.com, and through amazon.com. And I appreciate the opportunity to talk to such an international audience.